Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Sorry for the delay, but as I think now we are ready to begin our traditional open research seminars. And first of all, let me introduce our guest. Today we host Professor Volosovich. He works as professor of international finance at Erasmus University, Rotterdam. Vadym Volosovich received his PhD in economics from University of Houston in 2006, and I think that it would be interesting that he also holds his master diploma in economics from the National University of Kyiv-Mohyla Academy in association with Economic Education Research Consortium. In the past, Professor Volosovich has been a visiting scholar at research department of the International Monetary Fund, and now he came to visit us also as an expert of International Monetary Fund. The matter is that Professor Volosovich participates in our visiting scholar program, and by the way, I'd like to express my gratitude to the Canada IMF Capacity Building Project at the NBU for their financial support that makes it possible to organize the visiting research program. We personally thank Marko Škrep and Tatiana Stuzhuk for the work they performed. I'm not going to waste your time, and therefore I give the floor to Professor Volosovich, and he's going to speak on his recent work in progress, good and bad social capital and financial development. So please, Vadym.
Він працює. Добрий день, пані та панове, тут працюю. Чути мене? Так. Я дуже задоволений, що це вже мій третій візит до Національного банку. Ми розпочали це десь навесні цього року, в лютому. Да. І я так вважаю, що ми досягли вже деяких результатів. Тепер я відвідую Національний банк 2 тижні, і ми плануємо ще іншу роботу на початку наступного року. Я вибачаю, що я не можу давати цю презентацію на українській, бо це так би стаття, яку я презентую до різних аудиторій. Я думаю, що це якби хороша практика проводити ці семінари, відкриті семінари на англійській, щоб, як показують результати цього дослідження, це якби розширює горизонти нашого суспільства, я думаю. Мова це є таким містом між культурами, стирає, так мовити, кордони. І тому я буду презентувати на англійській. І я прошу, якщо будуть питання технічні чи якісь з приводу цієї презентації, задавайте, будь ласка, не треба чекати кінця презентації. Тобто я хотів би, щоб було максимально зрозуміло, що ми хочемо сказати. Тема, the topic of the paper I want to present today, it's indeed the unfinished work. It's almost finished work, but it's still in progress, right? So because we're still improving some of the data collected for this project, and it's based on experience of Mexico, where my co-author and former student Araceli comes from, right? So she has a lot of sort of experience from being a Mexican and a person who lives in that economy, and when we started this project, I realized that the issues and problems the Mexican economy faces, it's very similar to what Ukraine is experiencing through the years of independence and reforms. So the issue is, and that sort of, I think, makes this research very relevant for Ukraine and for even the policy-making institution like National Bank. So the motivation is very broadly what can explain financial underdevelopment of emerging economies, developing countries, right? So it's one, well, we all know, you don't need to be convinced that one of the most significant barriers to economic growth and development is limited use of financial markets, so formal financial arrangements, by which I mean banking sector, stock markets, and so on, for saving, for credit, for diversification of economic risks, right? And for instance, this data is from Mexico, which we studied in this paper. It's, for instance, only 18% of Mexicans used bank credit, and less than 15% saved in banking sector. And the banks in Mexico are very financially underdeveloped. They're very conservative, risk-averse, right? So when they lend to businesses or individuals, they ask for large and expensive collateral. And basically, even by regional standards, by the standards of Latin America, South America, Mexico is lagging behind. For instance, compared to countries like Brazil or Argentina, Mexican banks are very, very weak, right? And I mean, the paper is based on Mexican data, but the implications are very broad for the economies like Mexico, like Ukraine, like many countries in Asia, right? So what are the reasons, we ask, right? And basically, living in Ukraine, being from Ukraine or traveling or learning about development issues for my career, right? So we all would agree that, well, reasons for financial underdevelopment is indeed the financial and economic exclusion, by which we mean that people don't participate in markets, right? So they are engaged in very basic financial transactions in a very limited scale. And it can be on individual level, it can be in the level of business, right? So this financial exclusion is that you basically don't have access to credit, either because it's very expensive or basically it could be completely unavailable because of the financial markets. And well, we all know that many societies have a very big mistrust or lack of trust in formal laws and arrangements, right? So institutions, what we call, right? So let it be political institutions, economic institutions, or institutions like domestic banks, right? So people just mistrust that formal arrangements or laws would protect their savings or help their businesses to develop. And as a solution for this, right? So people just operate or live in what we call shadow economy, right? So people completely bypass the formal financial arrangements and they devise the mechanisms which sort of achieve the goal of, transacting or saving, but it's not in a formal economy. So this is completely missed by any official statistics, it's not regulated, it's not influenced by any mechanisms of which institutions like national banks, for instance, can use, right? So then, well, the paper was inspired by a book by a very famous economist from Peru, Hernando de Soto, who spent a lot of time studying the reasons for the shadow economy. And he said that, well, sometimes people just don't have other choice, right? So if it's expensive or too risky to operate in a formal economy, just people use the informal substitutes. And basically, what he said is that, well, sometimes people just don't have other choice, right? So if it's expensive or too risky to operate in a formal economy, just people use the informal substitutes. And basically, what he said is that, well, sometimes people just don't have other choice, right? So if it's expensive or too risky to operate in a formal economy, just people use the informal substitutes. And if you read sociologists or political economists, they call this phenomenon social capital. So behind these informal arrangements is what they call social capital. And this concept, which is pretty vaguely defined, right? So this concept of social capital, it's linked or causes the development of trust between individuals, right? Or trust of individuals to institutions and things like that. That's what sociologists and political economists teach us. So that's what, and in this paper we try to see how this social capital correlates or contributes to financial development on micro level of households. So, well, formally this financial development on the individual level called financial inclusion, right? So whether or not households use the formal financial markets, so banks, stock markets, or this kind of arrangements. And what we also do is what is very often overlooked in economic profession, right, is actually negative aspects of social capital for financial development. So traditionally economists say, okay, so if a society or group, right, accumulates this civicness or, you know, громадянське суспільство розбудовується, all this has the implications, the positive implications for social capital, right? For financial development. But it turns out there are some negative aspects of this. So that's what we try to pay attention and sort of remind to, in particular, economic profession. And in doing so, we exploit very rich household level data from Mexico. So there are two surveys. One survey is very standard, is a census, which is conducted in anywhere in the world. So it's in Mexico, it's conducted every other year, so once in 2 years. But the other survey, which actually captures this outcomes, this social capital, is a survey of values, so-called, right? And we have some discussions within the bank as well, so that it might be actually worthwhile to think about conducting such survey in Ukraine, or at least surveys which exist to extend it. I know that there is some survey conducted in Ukraine, but it's not very detailed, say, by the level of the oblasts, or it's not very rich in terms of questions asked. So it's, and actually the survey which is conducted on values, it was sponsored by the major commercial banks. Commercial banks and their marketing activities are very interested in these kind of questions. For marketing purposes, for attracting clients, especially in economies like this. So if they want to engage people to save in banks, use the credit, they need to know how people think. In a particular, as far as relationship between individuals or people's attitude toward banks, for example, is. So that's I think, very worthwhile. And I'll try to convince you that sort of in the data you see that kind of knowledge and this kind of social capital or trust between individuals is actually very important, if not more important than you know, efforts by the formal commercial banks to chase these clients. Okay, so let's go on. So what are the kind of channels? How this social capital affects financial development, and also what it is in a sense, right? So let's start from economists' view, right, which is very common, you know, in at least some of the fields, for instance, personal finance, right? But it started from very famous contributions by Nobel Prize winners, so who studied the cost of transaction and you know, the theory of the firms and so on. So basically, the main argument is that if people want to participate in formal financial markets, if they want to put their money into saving or invest in stock markets, they need to trust that this money will be not stolen, right? So that they'll safely return their investments and with return, right? So ultimately, all the financial contracts are trust-based instruments. So we need to trust the counterparty, right? So that's the step number one. So if the society or the group accumulates this trust, which by itself sort of a result of social capital, right, whatever it is, right? So then this stock of trust, in a sense, in society, trust between people. So in particular, what economists think, so we need to trust other people whom we don't know personally. So the question would be, okay, do you trust other Ukrainians in general? Strangers, right? So because when you invest in the formal markets, you invest your money with people you don't necessarily know, right? So you need to, on average, trust people, right? So then, if this exists in the society, then people would participate in those markets, and financial development will come. And then all other positive effects will commence, right? So there was this theoretical view and then evidence, which I only cite major kind of papers which started this debate, but essentially this is how economists see this importance of social capital for formal financial development. But sociologists, they take much more nuanced view. So they agree that there is a positive effect, but they also say, okay, so there are some negatives to the social capital, right? So in the definition sociologists offer is the following. So social capital is the benefits which people receive from interacting between each other, right? So we form a group, we form social or kind of informal networks through our interaction in a group, right? And we achieve some benefits from this, right? So for instance, if we know people, we can get a better job. If we know, we have the connections, we have more information about anything, right? So these are sort of positive benefits which accrue to individuals from interaction, right? So you don't sit by yourself in your room, right? So you sort of being a social person. So, but in addition to that, I say, so we need to also make an effort to accumulate this resource. So we need to actually get out and sort of make friends or make connections and things like that. So these are the benefits from social interactions and efforts made to acquire and build this resource. But then sociologists say, okay, so there is this positive effects of social capital for financial development, for formality, right? I was talking about when I discussed the economist view, right? So we trust strangers and we invest with, say, stock market, so say with. But there are these negative effects if the trust exists only in narrow networks. For example, to give example, diamond traders in, say, New York City or Antwerp, which are major centers of diamond cutting, right? So jewelry. So they don't write contracts between themselves. So there is this Jewish community who traditionally developed the trade of, you know, taking raw diamonds and making nice jewelry of them. So they don't write contracts between each other. Why? Because they know each other. So nobody breaks the contracts because this will be sort of punished by social pressure and things like that. But the consequence of this kind of narrow circle is that you're excluding others, right? So it's very narrow, tight network, and you first need to conform to the rules, informal rules of that. So if you behave not according to these informal rules, you are outcast, right? And conversely, it's hard to enter this network, right? So you like them, right? And this is not conducive to financial development, right? For example, the economic studies which started on this, they gave the example of Italy, right? So in Italy, there is a very developed north and underdeveloped south. So south is it has very traditional values, right? So they're very oriented on family, this interpersonal relationships, so narrow networks. Whereas in the north, people are less sort of caring about, being part of a family. They are more cosmopolitic traditionally from Middle Ages. So as a result, they participate, they are more active in, formal transactions. So this is kind of negative effects which sociologists knew forever, right? But economists sort of are so obsessed about finding this positive effect that they sort of neglected the negative stuff. And when you go to the research, so you always work to study empirically relationship. You have some proxies, you have a data, right, which measures the theoretical concept. So the available proxies of this concept of social capital, they are very often the mixture of these two, negative and positive aspects, or they are outcomes of the true theoretical concept. So, for example, that trust in a particular society between individuals may result from the social capital. For instance, how your parents taught you from, young age that is it good or bad to steal, to break the law, or to, things like that. So this is social capital, very inherent norms of economic behavior, of interpersonal behavior, or it could be the result of good law enforcement, for instance, right? So you trust that you won't be, your savings will not vanish because you know that you are protected by law. So, and then we don't know if this outcome, measured outcome, the high level of trust, is the result of social capital or good institutions or good law and all, right? So we need to control for these alternative factors. Yeah. So we take these concerns seriously, and this REACH survey allows us to decompose, to look at these negative and positive aspects of the social capital for financial development. Okay, so that I told already, so we can. So let me briefly tell about the data which is available in Mexico. So Mexico has built up a very good data in their statistical agency, right? So it's available. The census data is very rich. The website exists in Spanish and in English. So, of course, a lot of documents are still in Spanish, but, there is a big progress in that. And the official agency is engaged with the major think tank in Mexico called ITAM, Research Institute, and they are collaborating in initiatives like the surveys like this, right? So they have this rich household level data, large cross-section, which is stratified. It's representative by 32 Mexican states. And of course, the data is interesting, as I said, so because the Mexico also has this very large inherent informal sector, as much of the Latin America in developing emerging world. And at the same time, the Mexico was quite open to investment, to trade. So since 80s, it liberalized the external transactions. So NAFTA came into power. People travel a lot, legally or illegally, into the United States. We know that, and throughout, right? So even some of the Mexicans make even to Netherlands as the students, right? So sometimes. So, and what is interesting maybe for the audience here in the bank is that reforms which are kind of conducted by the current president in Mexico are aimed at building and strengthening the formal financial markets, formal banking. So the president ran on the program which was called Pact for Mexico, and it included 13 initiatives and laws. They passed 34 laws aimed at strengthening and promotion of formal bank lending, right? So to recapitalize banks, to establish and maintain the National Investment Agency for infrastructure projects, and so on and so forth. So, and overall, the achievements were there, so some kind of macro results emerged out of these initiatives, out of these reforms, and they were praised by international institutions, for instance, in their reviews of Mexican performance. So, but we ask, really, is this the right thing to target, given the conditions of informal sector and these things? So that's one of the motivations. So what are what policies should be devised? So let me move on to the substance. So the data is from two surveys, census and the National Survey of Values. Right? So the main results will be from this survey, because in this survey I have the financial outcomes, such as what instruments Mexicans use. There are questions: how do you save? Do you think it's good to save in cash? Do you want to borrow from your friends, family, or do you want to go to the pawn shop, right? Or rather, do you want to borrow or save in the bank? Or do you think it's, if you have money, do you invest them in business or property? These kind of questions. And at the same time, this survey has the questions like about social capital. Do you trust national institutions like government, parties, banks, right? So in addition to do you trust others, period, right? So whoever this means. Or do you trust your neighbors, right? Or, and also what is unique in this survey, they also asked about attitude to globalization. So given your personal experience, do you think the international trade is strengthening sovereignty of Mexico? Do you think NAFTA is good for economic development of Mexico? Or should we promote foreign direct investment in energy and electricity sector? So these are two sectors which were under government control for a long period of time in Mexico, and it's very politically charged issue was whether or not to privatize it or allow some foreign investment. So these kind of questions make it very useful to study the effect of social capital on financial development. And, of course, we have a host of individual characteristics, social economic conditions of towns, even including small ranches of 3-4 people, not only cities like Guadalajara or Mexico City with millions of population, but small towns, small villages are included in this survey. And so this is very rich data. So the only negative is that, again, so the commercial banks like this, they are not interested in repeating these kind of studies. So it was only conducted once in 2010, and unlike census, was not repeated. So it's, unfortunately, we only have one large, very high quality cross section. Right. So let's move on and let me present the results from this National Survey of Values. So, because the outcomes, the questions asked are yes, no, binary variables, do you use certain way of saving or investing, right? We need to estimate the model, which is a binary response model, for example, logic, which counts the odds ratio probability of certain outcome, PI, right, over the probability of not observing this outcome. So you can express it as a so-called odds ratio. So it's like, what are the probability of observing certain outcome? And then I control for this measure of bad trust, bad social capital for financial development I was talking about, whether or not people trust only in individuals in very narrow networks, or do they trust the broad networks? So trust in wide networks, I would say, right? So, or good social capital. And then I control for household characteristics, but also a formal bank penetration at the sort of, it's a proxy, how much of banking credit is sort of observed at the level of municipality. It's not exactly, I don't know exactly how much of, say, credit relative to output of the city, so I do a trick, right? So I take a state level bank to GDP, bank credit to GDP of state, right? And I multiply it to the characteristic of locality, right? So whether or not, so I assume that, okay, so if the town is sort of, has a good infrastructural characteristic, so for instance, it's centrally located, it has a good infrastructure, it has access, people who live there have access to schools, sanitation and things like that. In states which have a larger formal banking, so they have a bigger chance to actually have access to these banks, right? So, but I must stress that this is not necessarily supply or demand, so it's just the outcome. So basically we observe the banking activity in a state, and we say, okay, so if it's a major city, there is a bigger chance that, say, bank credit goes to that city, right? So I don't have banking or, you know, the penetration of banks in that particular town. So that's too much to ask, at least at this point. So let me present results based on only household characteristics. So just this is to convince ourselves and you that the data is actually valid. It's not, well, the results are believable, right? So these are the questions. Do you think it's a good idea to save in cash? So they don't know if we actually save in cash, but okay, so this is attitude to saving in cash is the worthwhile, right? So meaning that this is the most informal, so you take a cash and put it on the mattress, right? So, and notice there are no negative coefficients, right? So because I express them as so-called odds ratios, so interpretation is the following. So if the coefficient is larger than 1, there is a larger chance of people saving in cash. If it's less than 1, it's a smaller chance of saving in cash, right? So by stars, you see, so I have some proxies of, you know, the financial well-being of individuals, so whether or not they belong to high social class, if they say we have enough income, if the female is the head of household, age of the household head, married, if they say, okay, we love to take risks.
William?
Yes?
Do you keep in the same equation both low education and high education?
Yeah, so the good question. So, yeah, so there's it's a very good question. So we know that you cannot include dummies which completely exhaust all the opportunities, right? So the way I do it is actually, it's a lower quartile and highest quartile in education. So I exclude the middle. So low education means less than primary school. High education is some college degree. Okay, so I exclude kind of base category is people who have sort of complete school or some professional training. Right, so you see that education seems to be the most important variable which correlates with saving in cash. So if you have low education, and interpretation is very convenient, if the dummies are, the variables are 0, 1, you immediately see by how many percent the probability changes. So interpretation in the column there, for instance, if you have a low education, you have 30% higher chance to save in cash, on average. Whereas if you have some degree, right, so you're 40% less. So neighborhood quality is 5 categories. So with number 5 is meaning the most fancy, posh neighborhood. The number 0 is the poorest, backward location, right? So in column 3, I average them. There I present each category I'm meeting the worst neighborhood. And we see that people who live in the best sort of locations, they have a 50% lesser chance to save in cash. So, and it's almost monotone increase. So the better neighborhood gets, the lower chance that you will put your money on the mattress. So, and then I have the other ways of saving or borrowing informally, right? For instance, in Mexico, they, as well as in many locations in Asia and Latin America, they have what actually my father-in-law in Ukraine here, he said that in Soviet Union we would have this kassa взаимопомощи, right? So it's informal arrangement that, for instance, people at the table here, everybody puts, I don't know, 10 euros on the table and asks the question, who needs this money most this week? And Andrei says, I need it, right? So then pot goes to him. Next week we repeat, and then somebody else says, I need this money. And this arrangement repeats until members say, okay, let's stop, right? So we are not interested anymore, right? So it's very common, popular in Mexico. Then in column 5, informal saving, so this is this informal saving, right? Then the next column is whether or not you use credit from known people, family, friends, or co-workers, right? And then the last column there is whether or not you, in addition, go to pawn shop or loan shark, to these guys who kind of, you know, have a cash, but charge this gigantic interest, right? So it sort of coincides. So if you're in a sort of a lower social class, so you typically use these informal ways of borrowing. And if you're more educated, you typically don't use them. Whereas people who live in a better neighborhood also don't rely on informal finance that much, right? So that's the informal. And then when we go to the formal financial arrangements, like using banks for savings or using bank for credit, the story reverses, right? So for instance, if you're highly educated, right, or live in better neighborhood, there's a bigger chance that you use the bank. Possibly because you trust the bank, or possibly because there is a bank where you live, right? So of course, we don't know. So and the same like economic income and so on, right? And the last two columns present by Mexican standards, probably the most advanced way to save or invest. The question is, if you have, so do you want to invest in business or property? Do you buy, you know, apartment, house, or invest in your business? If you have, so this is like an analog of stock market, right, in a poor country like Mexico, which is probably very relevant for Ukraine, right? So we see, for instance, if you live in a better neighborhood, you almost twice bigger chance that you will buy some property or invest in a business, right? As well as if you are actually risk-loving, right? So if you say, I'm risk-loving, I like to take a risk, so 20% higher chance that you would invest in business or property, right? Which is, so all these results are just to say, okay, so data is not garbage, right? So it's believable. So, but there is no news, no social capital here. So here's the conditional of all this, what you saw, right? So it's included household characteristics. So I add this question which reads, in general, would you say that a majority of people can be trusted, or you cannot be too careful, right? And it doesn't specify who people are, right? Are they Mexicans in general? Are they your neighbors? Are you your family? And things like that. So it turns out that if you say people can be trusted, you tend to participate in this касса взаимопомощи, Роскас, or use informal credit, right? But you're less likely to save and invest. This is what actually opposite to the similar study from Italy, because in Italy, Italians who says we trust others, the result would be reverse. So in the data, it look like either Mexicans by asking, do you trust others, they immediately think not strangers, but family, or the second possibility is that this measure is very noisy because it has this negative and positive components to that, right? So it's a mixture of, at least, you know, the negative trust in narrow networks dominates in this particular question. And I included this question because it's very standard in value research, in social capital research question, which is used, for instance, in country-level surveys of values, maybe even in Ukrainian survey, which exists, right? So this is a very general question, do you trust others? Yes. So, but our survey allows to do slightly better. So we use two additional proxies of social capital. The first one is the proxy for narrow network. So the question goes like this. What part of the country you identify yourself with? Do you think that you are from Kiev? Do you think you are from Kiev Oblast or, you know, Eastern Ukraine? Do you think you are from Ukraine? Or do you think, or you don't identify with any geographic location? So you're sort of, you know, citizen of the world, right? So we call it local identity. So, and we argue that if you say I'm from my own town, you're very local. You have developed a very narrow network. So your social network is very limited, right? So this is, whereas there is a second group of questions asking, okay, for example, do you think that foreign investment is beneficial for the development of your country? On the rank from 10, the best, yes, it increases development, it contributes to development the most, to the number one, which says it actually hurts. Right? So here we say this is a proxy of trust in wide networks. Right? Because if, for instance, you developed, no matter how, right? So you developed an attitude that the globalization or trade or NAFTA, I have several questions like this, right? Is good. This means that probably you traveled, you saw different cultures, and you interacted with all sorts of people, right? So, and you developed this trust in that, you know, these broad networks are good. And so we use these proxies together with the standard trust and other. And it seems that indeed, so if you develop a local identity, if you have this very local identity, so you're more likely to save in cash, whereas if you think that the globalization is good, the probability is lower. See, so this is sort of, I didn't see in economic research, so you really have these two components of trust, the trust in narrow networks and trust in sort of broad networks. So in a sense, this is a sort of key result of the paper, right? So if people possess, and it's immediately seen, so if you have the outcome, which is a mixture of the two, then it's sort of almost random, right? So you cannot predict whether or not the general trust dominates, especially as in literature, it's not individual. Usually it's an average level of trust or local identity or so on, right? So that's the main takeaway, sort of. And then, of course, we need to sort of attack this specification with adding, for example, alternative explanation for trust and financial development. As I said, so you can trust in other people, or you can be positive about globalization, for instance, if you trust in law enforcement, right? Or you ask for formal financial loan or you go to bank if you are confident in the banks, right? So, and it's very telling that, okay, so of course if you trust banks, then you use bank credit or saving bank, right? And not use informal. And for instance, for investment or saving additional cash, trust in law seem to matter. And the result with this local and narrow and wide network persists. Okay, so but the most important, of course, for policy to say, okay, so far we need to be very careful. So we should interpret these results that on average people who trust strangers in wide networks, they tend to save in a formal way or tend to not to put money under mattress. But to say, okay, promote the civil society or mutual trust between, broader society at large, and then good things will come, so you need causal relationship, right? Of course, it's pretty difficult because, well, there is this indigeneity issue, right? So it could well be the case that there is a reverse causality, for example, right? And it comes, so why this might be the case is from, again, we go back to sociology's definition of social capital, and we read now in italics that, okay, these are the benefits from social interaction, but also we need to make an effort, continuous effort to improve this resource, right? We need to build and maintain, we need to call our friends once in a while, right? So to keep up our social network, right? This means that, for example, you participate in financial markets and you accumulate some experience with, bad or good experience, and you might build up some trust or mistrust, right, in people. So your savings were burnt you put the money in the wrong bank, it's lost, right? And your trust in others immediately, falls. Not only to banks, but any person all of a sudden becomes less trustworthy, right? So this is the nature of the problem we need to address. So, of course, it would be nice to have a panel of the data to see some, some shock, exogenous shock, which would, allow us to address this. I don't have it. I have only one cross section, so I try to find the variables which arguably affect the level of trust in wide networks or tight networks, but not financial development directly. So I proxy, I instrument foreign investment beneficial kind of questions, right, or trust in loose network by the measure which is called remoteness, right? So in the United States, there are 7 major cities where the Latin people, so people from Latin America come from, including Mexico. It's Los Angeles, Chicago, New York, Denver, Miami, and something else. So I take these cities, I take their population, and I compute the weighted average of the distance from each in each location with what I absorb by the size of this population, the major cities in the US. So the idea is the following. So if you far away from a largest, location where Mexicans live, say in Chicago for some reason, well, we know the reason because it's cattle farming was Mexicans would drive cattle all the way to Chicago, so there was a lot of immigration in Chicago. So, or if you further away from LA or Chicago, so it's likely you actually travel there or have some connections to these people. So on average, of course, and I also have this similar, there's just simple average distance from your town by the parallel, the longitude to US border, right? And the instrument for local identity is just your town size, right? And whether or not this is a rural community, right? So the argument is that if your city is small, or if it's a rural community, it's more likely that you say, I am from that particular location, and you develop a trust only in the people who are your neighbors and close network. So that's the instruments. And let me present you this IV regression, first stage. So this is first stage regression where local identity is on the left-hand side, right? And basically the larger the town is, the less likely you say, I'm from that town. The more likely you say, I'm from this country, or not at all. And a rural community increases the chance that you'll identify with locality, right? Whereas the first stage regression for foreign investment beneficial, so your positive attitude to foreign investment is negatively correlated to this remoteness, right? So this is the kind of first stages are significant. And then basically the second stage where the local identity and foreign investment are instrumented by this. So the results remain, right? So now I can, with some degree of confidence, if you like, if you convince with these instruments, right? So we can say this is a causal relationship. Okay. So let me probably, how much time? So I need to wrap up, right? I'll just tell that in addition to that, we exploit, so the questions in this survey were whether or not you use cash or bank to save or invest and so on, right? So what I also use is a census, right? And this is very standard data, but in Mexico, and I guess everywhere, it also has the expenditures on financial markets. So basically they report how much Mexicans spend on depositing in a bank, in credit card expenditures, or other debts, which is very unprecise, and we call them and they say, okay, so this can be some informal debts, or it could be some formal debts, so it's a mixture. It's not very precise type of variable. So we exploit these, right? So the problem is that in the census, I don't have these questions, you know, do you trust others and things like that. So I need to merge with the census. And the only common identifier is the state, right? So what I need to do is I take the average of social capital from values survey at the state level. I merge with the census data, and I also interact it or localize it, right? So by using index which characterizes marginality of location. So basically it says, okay, whether or not your town has these characteristics. So these are 3 random states, right? So Jalisco, Oaxaca, Veracruz, right? So the higher the number from 1 to 5, the better it is, right? So for instance, there is a data from different sources which says, okay, do you have any school nearby? Okay, do you live in a house which has dirt floor, right? So there is no, you know, floor. So you're just basically in a shack. So do you live in some remote town in the, you know, middle of the jungle, right? So, or do you have, you know, do you think that you don't have enough money to live? So these are kind of the, so we say, okay, so I take this trust variable and I say, okay, so if the effect of this state level trust is different in the location which vary along this state. So I sort of create the variation, right? So I create the variation better. So basically the regression would be trust in narrow networks of the state S times the marginality or the quality of the municipality of the person I, right? So basically, the interpretation would be, okay, so if you trust, if you're narrow-minded, so sort of you trust a narrow network and live in better neighborhood, you know, this kind of counterbalances. But I got a very nice comment from Kiev School of Economics, so what probably I want to do is kind of take one minus marginality in a sense, right? So it's kind of reinforces. If you're a bad neighborhood and you trust local neighborhood, you're stuck there, right? So you for sure sort of don't use any formal. Whereas if you trust wide networks and live in a better neighborhood, so there's a bigger chance to do that. So that's what I'm going to do. And so this is almost the end of the talk. So basically, and it's not enough variation, so the results are not as significant. So for instance, if you have this good attitude to foreign investment in a state, right? So if your state is typically positive about foreign investment, which is the states which are along the border with the United States, and a bit larger, with some exceptions, or the states where a lot of tourists are, right? So the ones which are sort of along the Mexico Gold Coast, so to call, but not the ones where oil is pumped. So Yucatan Peninsula turns out is negative about investment, of course, because there is a lot of FDI, but all this money doesn't stick there, so it's get probably repatriated. So people are not so positive about foreign investment out there. So if you're in a sort of positive to this investment and live in better neighborhoods, so you sort of accumulate debts. I don't know if it's good or bad, right? So it remains to be. So sometimes you say, okay, so what really contributes to the growth is saving, not necessarily credit, right? So the credit can be wasted. So that, in a sense, so we compare the expenditures on bank deposits and credit cards, and again, by Mexican standards, credit card is probably most financially advanced instrument out there, right? So at least, you know, we see in a better location, people tend to use credit cards more and less bank deposits, right? Why? Because bank deposit is boring, is a very conservative way to save. So that's my interpretation. But the results are not so strong, but they are consistent with the more detailed data from individual survey. So let me conclude. So we, basically in studying this inclusion in financial markets and thinking about the policy, we need to think this concept of social capital, this trust between people, right? And we also need to be very careful, what do we mean by trust? Do people trust, you know, their neighbor from their, you know, local community, or is it, you know, we all, and I mean, I don't know, so what's the development over 10, 20 years of independence, because we have this very negative saying in Ukraine, right? So it seems like it's not the trust in broader network, right? So it doesn't sound like, so if people behave like that, right, so this means that the formal financial development is not going to flourish, right? So results seem to be robust and causal, right? So then we can talk about very carefully about possible policy implications, right? So what kind of policies we can talk about in terms of financial inclusions by individuals, right? So what can be more pragmatic, practical in the near term, and of course things like that you hear all the time, right? So we need to improve rule of law, we need to eliminate drastic disparities in the quality of communities, you know, improve the quality of infrastructure and things like that, reduce the cost of operating in a formal economy, for example, right? It could be, you know, cost of registering the business and all these kind of direct and indirect costs. But we also need to be very serious and facilitate development of civil society. So we need to make sure that the people treat each other, you know, in a civic way and trust each other, right? So in a wide network. So it's good to have a family values, but it's also good to name and, you know, to be proud to be Ukrainian or even European or even, you know, person in the global world. So, and of course, we need to build and maintain trust in domestic banks, and this is direct implication for institutions like these, right? So, but also we need to educate population, because the result says, okay, so level of education, and especially recent work in this household finance as financial education, right? So not just level of education, but, you know, very specific teaching children about money, about credit. For example, in Netherlands, every booklet with credit card says, warning, you know, borrowing money costs money. So things like that, right? So we need to educate people so that the credit card is not the cash machine, right? So we need to actually pay back. So these are things which are, in principle, feasible in the near term. And of course, I would say, you know, making sure that people travel and see how things are. You know, learn language is also very conducive to this kind of stuff. So that concludes my talk today. So and I'll be happy to answer some questions, maybe even in Ukrainian. Thank you. Да.
Дозволите, значит, представляю сферу пиар-послуг, да, и понимаю, что вы сводите все к тому, что очень много зависит именно от доверия, да, в обществе, между людьми, между семьями, коллективами. Вот. И какие, на ваш взгляд, необходимы именно пиар-действия, пиар-акции для того, чтобы укрепить общество и таким вот образом рекламным, что ли, маркетингом, да, что объединить их в одно целое, и таким образом социальный капитал заиграл в новую силу, скажем так. Спасибо большое.
Ну, это опять же, в принципе, моя власна думка, що ну, кожна країна повинна замислюватися на ці питання з точки зору навіть філософської. Тобто у нас є філософські факультети, які повинні думати на ці питання. Тобто це вже така сфера, яка йде поза економічними, це такі соціальні, політичні, соціологічні питання. І, ну, повинна ми ну, як сказати, тобто повинна розвиватися культура довіри між людьми. І взаємна повага, і ну, починаючи з, може цей розвиток громад на Україні, це цей інститут, який буде якось розвивати якісь вузькі спочатку мережі між людьми, але потім вже воно буде, як громади, скажімо, будуть збільшуватися чи якось взаємодіяти у якісь. Тобто всі кроки, які розбудовують, що ми кажемо, це громадянське суспільство, я думаю, це буде впливати на такі. Ну і в принципі великий позитивний шок – це навіть біометричні паспорти, які дають нам можливість подорожувати до Європи без віз. Це такий великий шок для розвитку і для розширення кругозору українців, я думаю. І, ну, вивчання іноземних мов також. Тобто це такі, ну, ми повинні бути прагматичними, що можна зробити зараз. Тобто всі ми знаємо, що треба боротися з корупцією чи там покращувати rule of law. Ну, можуть бути якісь такі, ну, і освіта, це в принципі те, що можливо, думаю, досягнути. Ну і навіть такі лозунги, які я бачив в метро, що розмовляйте рідною мовою і таке інше, це дуже важливо і правильно, я думаю.
Через анкетирование участвовали, или только исключительно официальные данные, или это предоставлялись данные банками. И второй вопрос тот же. Результаты вашего исследования были имплементированы на практике деятельности других государств, скажем так, и планируете ли вы в дальнейшем занимать и проваживать, тобто эти все ваши результаты, модели, соответственно, на развитие финансового сектора України?
Дякую за питання. Я думаю, що практичні якісь кроки. Дані на самом деле вони вже доступні на веб-сайті Banamex. Тобто цей комерційний банк, який заплатив за це опитування, вони є. Вони на іспанській, якщо в тебе є соавтор на...
Данные были открыты, по сути.
Данные уже открыты. Данные открыты, то есть их просто нужно было найти. И в принципе в Мексике часто коммерческие банки, которые пытаются привлечь клиентов, в том числе из серой экономики, они спонсируют и проводят подобные исследования. Это не единственный, это самое такое глубокое исследование, но такие, опять же, как это может использоваться, мы должны спросить коммерческие банки, какие у вас есть сейчас маркетинговые исследования и как это строится, что вы хотите знать о клиенте. В принципе, это может с точки зрения для policy making, да, то есть в Центральном банке Центральный банк уже очень давно ведет опрос об деловых ожиданиях, то есть предприятий и все такое. В принципе, если приоритетом банка, насколько я узнал, является также поновлення кредитування і все таке, довіри до фінансового. Тобто можно перенять позитивный опыт той же Мексики, да, как и развить подобные исследования уже на уровне домохозяйств. То есть, как это было исследовано, то есть статья только, подобные статьи, то есть есть большое количество, исследования про то, как сделать людей, включить их в банковскую систему.
Процесс отбора выборки, понятно.
Да, то есть, например, я разговаривал с одним, это тоже к слову, проводился эксперимент такой социальный в Колумбии. Да, то есть исследователи из университета Мэриленда поехали в Колумбию и сказали мелким бизнесам в Колумбии: мы заплатим первые 3 года за вашу регистрацию и все издержки монетарные. Тут же это treatment group, как это по-русски, то есть они вышли из тени, они стали оперировать легально. Потом этот
фидбэк был позитивный.
Да, то есть в принципе потом это было отменено, и тут же большинство предприятий снова ушло.
То есть мотивация
То есть
пошла,
это интерпретируется, это может быть даже прямые издержки именно оперировать. То есть,
а если на уровне нашего государства, то каким образом это можно сделать? Я понимаю, через банки, соответственно, какие-то данные, чаще всего данные наши какие обезличенные, да, принятие участия в самом переписи, формируется база сейчас клиентская, кредиторов, юр и физлиц, да, это, безусловно, мы слышали. А как, допустим, вот эти ваши summary, да, то есть ваши поинты, как их можно сейчас имплементировать на наше государство, наш вид?
Например, уже довольно подобные опросники, они развиты, то есть есть так называемый World Value Survey, есть European Social Surveys. То есть эти опросы существуют с 80-х годов.
Рейтинги, да,
то есть именно спрашиваются вот эти values. Так? Они не разбиты по регионам, то есть они на уровне страны. Есть репрезентативные выборки на стране, но они не такие детальные по областям. Тут же, тут вплоть до то есть, естественно, это дорого сделать, такую большую выборку, но и в принципе, не нужно это делать, то есть делаются такие исследования, может быть, раз в 5 лет. Да, то есть, в принципе, social capital, trust, довера, она не меняется каждый день. Может быть, есть какие-то шоки, как, например, финансовый кризис или какие-то большие потрясения, то, естественно, оно меняется. Но Ну, я думаю, как уже это ввести, это уже заинтересовать коммерческие банки.
Структуры, да, принять участие в этом развитии.
Да, организовать, может быть, какие-то вузы, в принципе, студентов. Я бы попросил своих студентов поучаствовать и мотивировал их, то, что они могут использовать это в своих диссертациях.
Спасибо.
Спросите, есть ли у вас какие-то планы по дальнейшему развитию этой темы, или уже считаете, что, в принципе, финиш?
Ну, мы еще в конкретном приложении в Мексике установить, являются ли это, эти взаимоотношения причинными, то есть хотелось бы еще использовать какие-то инструменты, которые, какие-то переменные, которые исторические, то есть, как в эмпирических исследованиях обычно какие-то исторические инструменты, которые уж точно не являются причиной сегодняшних событий. Например, в Мексике есть данные, история этой страны была с колонизацией связана, да? То есть есть данные, в принципе, по количеству, сколько при колонизации было убито местного населения, испанскими колонизаторами по географическим. Это, естественно, были места, эти города-государства, то есть, в принципе, и сейчас есть большая разница по штатам Мексики, сколько там есть коренного населения, которое ведет свои... То есть, в принципе, мы попробуем посмотреть, какой есть траст, довера в тех местах, где много коренного этого населения. В принципе, я не знаю, какие ожидания. Да, но... Да. Это тоже, да. То есть, если есть много diverse, с одной стороны, большое, если есть в каком-то месте живут люди разных религийных верований и так дальше, да, то есть, с одной стороны, это расширяет твой горизонт, но с другой стороны, возникает трение, и, то есть, это... это все подобные исследования, они я работаю на кафедре финансов, то есть это, вы знаете, что Нобелевская премия по экономике в этом году была присуждена на behavioral economics и finance профессор Талер, да, то есть это все идет уже в сферу, которая между социологией и экономикой, которая является сейчас самым таким перспективным направлением, то есть мы наконец-то экономисты поняли, что люди все не роботы обезличенные, то есть есть большие разницы между то, какие у нас есть. Да, то есть, конечно, как это все измерить и использовать, это уже другой вопрос.
Трошки по інструментарію дослідження. Ви виокремили, структурували фінансовий простір, так би мовити, формальний та неформальний сектор. От щодо кредитних союзів, credit union, ви їх віднесли до неформального сектору, тому що це дуже умовно. Чесно кажучи, ми не можемо розглядати credit union як неформальний сектор. Це нонбанківська система. Це формальний сектор, просто не банківська система. За якими критеріями ви його визначили як неформальний сектор?
Дивіться, ці розказ, так называемые rotating credit associations, они не формализованы, то есть это не юридическое лицо, то есть оно не регулируется, оно не...
Тому що в Україні, наприклад, це не відноситься до неформального сектора. Є законодавство, воно регулюється все, подається звітність.
Понятно, но по этим...
В Мексиці інакше, ви хочете?
Тут нету никаких, абсолютно нет никаких, это неформальные объединения между друзьями и соседями. То есть, например, в экваториальной Африке были исследования на подобные инструменты, что происходит, там люди обмениваются домашними животными, чтобы суп сварить. Вот, такие есть, формализация этих отношений не существует. То есть, но я, опять же, в Мексике очень большое распространение получили вот эти как это сказать, мелкое кредитование, да, то есть даже с помощью банков и формальной банки и международной компании, этого, к сожалению, нету выборки, то есть они нету, то есть вы принимаете ли вы участие, берете ли вы кредит в кредитном, вот этот вот microcredit institution.
Credit union.
Да, такого нет. Ну, опять же, формальний...
З точки зору цілей вашого дослідження, може, воно і не важливо, тому що феномен довіри, звичайно, це дуже цікавий інститут, і взагалі проблема дуже цікава.
Я думаю, ну, в принципі, ну, якісь такі шаги культурного плану, щоб розбудовувати довіру в суспільстві, навіть не до державних інституцій, а між індивідуумами, між людьми, то це дуже позитивний аспект.
Того ми фактор можемо розглядати.
Обходится за пределами этих исследований? Или какие-то все-таки есть попытки отследить взаимосвязи между там уровнем образования или еще чем-то?
Ну, в принципе, как я сказал, в Мексике уже аккумулировано большое количество хороших данных. То есть, как бы, но они пока, ну, по крайней мере, открытые данные агрегированы на уровне штата. То есть это недостаточно. Вот. Если, скажем, даже, например, возможно, я бы скорее, ну как, что приходит на ум, то есть если ты saving cash, скорее всего это имеется в виду не в песо, то есть скорее всего это хранение денег идет в твердой валюте, то есть да. Ну да. Ну, не знаю, я не смотрел на это. В каком плане это, как бы, какая теория, то есть долларизация, то есть как бы это конкурент формально? Ну да.
Усложняет проведение монетарной политики и вот.
Ну да, это, то есть часть, как бы, если посмотреть на общий торговый баланс той же Украины, большое количество есть так называемые net errors and omissions, да, то есть обычно как бы в агрегированной макрофинансовой литературе это интерпретируется как неучтенный отток капитала, но в том числе в наличные валютные средства, то есть как бы. Но тут нет, мы никак не смотрели. То есть, например, вот эти вот результаты, опять же, из census, да, но, то есть другие долги включают то есть вот такие вот неформальные долги, но и формальные. Например, там есть вопрос, ну, вернее, данные по кредитам, то есть bank loans, но там настолько мизерные суммы, которые, скорее всего, люди их относят к другим долгам, то есть, там, или там те же долларовые какие-то платежи между, то есть оно может быть зашито в этих other debts, но нет количества. Как бы портфель, как разбит портфель как бы инвесторов, ну, домохозяйств, тут таких нет. Дуже дякую за увагу.
Thank you for coming here, and thank you, Vadym, for really impressive presentation. See you next time. The next our open research seminar will be on the 6th of November, and the head of research at from the Riksbank will present his project entitled Designing a Simple Loss Function for Central Banks. Thus, a dual mandate makes sense. So don't miss, please. So, thank you.
Дуже
Good
дякую
luck.
за увагу і за можливість доповісти.